Now we're going to talk about community interactions. This is an interaction usually between individuals of different species, or it can be individuals of the same population interacting, but that would be more on the population level, but still it is considered a community interaction just because it's usually groups of certain individuals within species. Not necessarily single species, single individual interactions with one other interaction. It's kind of like groups of this ones over here versus other groups, but within a species. So this is interspecific. Inter means between, so that would be between species, and intraspecific would be within species. Now, one of the big things that we look at is competition. We all know what competition is because, we've played sports, etc. But competition in terms of this, that is species interaction, would be interaction over some kind of resource that's in a limited supply. So I usually use this diagram to represent, that is, the R is the resource, and this would be species A and B are overlapping in their use of that resource. If A is the best competitor, then what can happen is something called competitive exclusion. That is where A will outcompete B. B is out of there, has to either use another resource or dies off, and it will exclude that organism from the environment. So an example of that is in your textbook, this diagram here. This diagram shows you two species that are interacting over a resource, which is a rocky shoreline environment near the ocean. Both of these species are competing, but in this case, this species is a better competitor. So over time, it's going to take over the niche of the other one. Now this brings to mind another term called ecological niche. This is the kind of general, it's what a species actually needs from the environment. So it includes everything. It's habitat, it's resources that it needs, nesting sites or reproductive efforts, etc. So it includes all, basically what the organism does for a living, right? So there are two types of niches. They're called fundamental niche or realized niche. The fundamental niche is like the potential one that organism can actually take up if given the chance, and a realized niche is what they actually have. That is if competition is keeping them at bay. So like in this case, these guys are competing. This is the realized niche of this species and the realized niche of that one, but the fundamental niche will take over if this one is a better competitor. All right. Okay, so the other thing is this may also cause something, sorry about that, cause something called character displacement. So this was Darwin's finches, and this is a different island habitat. So this is one island, this is another, this is another. And these are the two types of finches and beaks that we're talking about. And you notice that the beaks are quite a bit different. This one is, using a different resource, maybe more seeds, and this one would be more, perhaps maybe fruits or something. I don't really actually know what these are, but just as an example. And if it's on a big island, they could actually spread out and actually have, they're not really competing. Both of their realized niches are not overlapping, and there is no competitive exclusion because there's not a resource in limited supply. Now, on a smaller island, if that resource in limited supply was, say, what I said was fruit, then this one would take over and competitively exclude that one, or vice versa. That could happen. And this is what we call character displacement, where the character, which is the beak depth, has been changed because of competitive interaction. So that's something called character displacement. Okay, now another thing is something that we call resource partitioning. Resource partitioning is where species use different parts of a resource differently. That is, let's say, for example, so a really famous example is these 5 species of warblers that are very, very closely related. Their chromosome numbers are very close. They probably were one species at one time. But so let's just say, for example, there's 5 different ones. So we'll say species 1. If no other individuals are using this resource of this tree, what would happen is species 1 would just use the whole resource. But the second that another one shows up, then species 1 will take over its actual realized niche, the one that is most suited to what it needs. So warblers eat bugs that are on the base of leaves. So what in this case, let's say species 1 likes the top. If another species shows up, it'll just move up to the top and the other one will move down. And then likewise, in this case, they showed 5 different species using this resource the same. They had inside, for the top, it was just the top. For the middle, they had inside the canopy versus outside. And for down here, they had inside the canopy versus outside. So they had 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 that could take that, and they were partitioning the resource in a sort of shared kind of way. All right. Now another thing that is kind of combining these things. Well, so let's say, for example, that hold on a second. I'm trying to get this on here. Okay, so let's say, for example, I have like a bog. A bog is just like a wetland kind of area. And I have highs and lows in the bog. So this line is representing the highs and lows in the bog. And I have 3 species of sphagnum moss, let's say. As species A likes it dry, species B likes it wet, and species C likes it whatever, all right? So what will happen is A will take over all the dry spots, and B will take over all the wet spots, and species C is just left with whatever's left over, all right? So species A, it turns out, are very good competitors. So they will outcompete. Let's say the water level rises. They are going to be pushed out because species B will outcompete C here. C will move up, and B will take over. Species A, vice versa. If the water level declines, then A will take over, pushing species C down, and B will be competitively excluded. So A and B will competitively exclude C and the other one out of their environments, and but C ends up staying in whatever environment. In other words, C can get pushed around in terms of its actual realized niche, because its fundamental niche is the entire thing, whereas species A and B, their fundamental niches are very specific. So we call species A and B a specialist. Usually these guys do not do quite as well in changing environments because they need certain specific types of conditions in their environment, whereas C, being a generalist, is likely to do better in a changing environment. So this is where we see things like possums or raccoons or squirrels or whatever. They are generally they're generalists, and that because of that, they can do well with humans and trash and things like that, which you would not normally think of as being a positive food source for other types of organisms. Okay, so another thing to consider is what we call predator-prey relationships. Predator-prey relationships are, the predator, of course, is the one doing the eating, and the prey item is the one being eaten. So let's consider 2 things, squirrels and hawks. What is happening is, this is showing a squirrel population that's going up and down around its carrying capacity, which in this case, the hawk is the limiting factor. So what is happening is, as the squirrel populations rise, the hawk populations will also rise. And as their populations rise, the squirrel population will decline, and then the hawk population will decline, and it will go up and down around the carrying capacity in sort of this lag fashion. So this is being really simplistic about it. I'm not sure that squirrels and hawks actually would do it in that kind of lag, but in general, that can happen, all right? So another thing that you could consider is herbivory. Herbivory is kind of the same thing, except for your prey in this case is some kind of plant item, so like seeds or something like that, or fruits or whatever. And you could still show a growth curve that, I'm sorry, a curve that would look like this. That is populations fluctuating around their carrying capacity based on in a lagging fashion, where this would be the seed source, and this maybe is the bird eating the seed source, going up and down together. All right, so that's a typical kind of interaction. Another thing that predator-prey relationships, of course, can affect is numbers, obviously. That is, predators are going to keep the carrying capacity of the species lower because it's a limiting factor. So that's one thing, but the other thing could be it also affects diversity. And this is not something that you necessarily think of, but there's a really famous examples of wolves in Yellowstone Park, where the wolves were hunted out. So the wolves were the top predator, and what they did was when they kill, they leave behind parts of the bodies, whatever they're killing, and that leaves some things for other organisms to eat. And it allows a whole bunch of other organisms to make it. So what they noticed was this in reverse. That is, when they took out the wolf, then coyotes sort of took over. Coyotes eat everything, and that made a species decline in the other species. Things didn't have things to eat, so they declined. So the diversity can be kept up by having a species present that is a good predator. There is a video online that is talking about this. Sorry, my voice is giving out. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about is symbiosis. I'll back out so you can take a view. I have to stop.